Alright, so as you can see from the title of this video and also the intro clip, the car is fixed. So we went ahead and pulled it over the pit because we got some things we're going to be doing in the next video, but I want to dedicate this video to what we were looking for to fix the problem and also how we went ahead and fixed the problem. It's not what you think it is, so be sure to stay tuned. For everyone who missed out on the last video, we had a little problem after the dyno where I had two cam codes. One for the left hand side, one for the right hand side. Now these were for the cam actuators, so they weren't actually for the cam position sensors, they were for the actuators. So I'll show you where they are now and then we'll chat a little more about them. On the front of the engine here, this is the cam actuator, that little piece with the banjo bolt on it and the blue connector. So what that does is it basically tells the cam when to advance the timing on the intake side. The newer engines have it on the intake and the exhaust. This only has it on the intake. So the cam position sensor is actually back up under there. It's probably pretty hard to see, but it's directly behind this fitting right here. That was not the code. So here is the one on the other side, right here. So it had a code for this side and that side. So as you can see, it was P2089 and P2093. We're not sure why the codes were being thrown, so we have a host of different places we had to look. First thing we did was we went ahead and ohmed out the entire circuit from the blue plugs back to the ECU. This would tell us if there's extreme resistance in the wire, or if it's shorted to ground, or if it's just basically not making continuity. So I'll show you how we did that real quick. For both sides, we would go ahead and unplug the blue connector here. And then we would go into the cab of the car where the ECU is located. And also, I'm not gonna get too in depth with all the color codes of the wires and all that stuff, just because it's a little too much for this type of video. As you can see, there's a bundle of wires down in there. So using my book, it's a wiring diagram book for this car, I went ahead and located which wires are which, and we ran an ohms test on our multimeter on both sides for both wires coming back to the ECU. Now when we did this, we didn't find any issues at all. We also ran a couple more tests that are similar, but they would detect for problems like short to ground or short to another circuit high. So we found no issues with all of that. So we were left scratching our heads, and I didn't film any of that because it was a very tedious ongoing process. So if that didn't fix the problem, then what did? Now we will talk about that a little bit. So one of the best things with these cars is that there's tons of forums online and you can learn a lot just from reading a bit of info. With that being said, typed in the codes on Google, typed in how they come up, because they would only come up together. They would never come up separately. That's a big point. A lot of other people had a similar thing. They had both codes, they had poor idle quality, and they didn't know why. So what they ended up finding, the ground that is typically on the intake manifold, I'll put a picture up here with a circle over that, but the ground that's typically on the intake manifold was not grounding correctly or properly. Maybe they left it loose, whatever the case may be. They tightened up the ground. Now all of a sudden all their idle issues are gone and they don't have the codes anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about this whenever we were diagnosing the problems, just because it was the exact same issue that I was having. So with that in mind, I wanted to check the full grounding of the entire car to make sure that we were getting good grounds everywhere. And then if we weren't, even if that didn't fix the problem, I knew it was a problem that still needed to be fixed. So that was our next objective, to try to check out the grounding of the car. So the first way we did that was we went to the back of the car, we put a load tester on the battery just to see what it was back there. So it was about maybe 12.5, which is normal, and then you load it down and it's probably about 11.5, which is normal. That's good for any normal battery. But we go to the front of the car, we load test it again. You shouldn't have much of a voltage drop from the rear to the front. All you have is a wire going up to the front and it's grounded up there as well. So you're looking for around the same readings, maybe 0.1 volt less up front. So go to the front, load test it at the starter and the chassis ground, just like you're doing in the back, but just with the chassis and the wire of resistance, because we have one ground in the back that goes straight to a chassis ground, and then we don't actually have a ground running forward. We only have a hot wire running forward. So you're measuring the resistance somewhat in the hot wire and also the chassis ground from the front to the rear. So our reading up front was starting around 11, and I mean 11 flat. That is obviously lower than you'd like to see the drop between those two places. There's no reason for that. Then we load it and it goes down to about 9.5, which means that under load, the starter probably only had a little less than 9 volts because your load tester is not pulling the amperage that your starter is gonna pull. Yeah, I knew that was a problem and I didn't know why it was doing that, but I knew that there was some type of voltage drop from the rear of the car where the battery is to the front of the car. So then I went ahead and I did a resistance test between the chassis because I figured there wasn't an issue with my hot going to the front because it was a direct contact and there's never been anything wrong with the wire. So went ahead and ran a resistance test between the chassis ground from the front to the back. Found extreme amounts of resistance, 1.3 ohms, which is higher than what you should see it by far. It should be around 0.2 ohms. So I knew that that was dragging us down a bit and an issue that needed to be fixed, but I didn't have great expectations that it would fix our issue that we're talking about in this video. My plan to fix this was originally to try to kind of clean up the grounds everywhere and then hope that it was better, but to solidify the grounding issue and fix it once and for all, I decided to go ahead and run a wire from the back all the way to the front. And that was directly off the battery, from the ground on the battery, all the way to the ground on where the transmission bolts to the engine. So it was basically linking all of the grounds together through a wire from the battery. So if we had a bad chassis ground in the back, it would solve that because we're grounding it now to the front directly with a wire. And then in order to feel even more confident about the grounds, I ran an extra ground from the TGVs over to the main ground, which is where my intake manifold grounds are. So I'll show you guys what that looks like a little bit from the front. We'll save a look for the undercarriage in the next video. So it may actually be pretty hard to see, but down here on the rear of the TGV is where the ground is that it hooks up to the engine harness, and those are the ones that we were talking about that could potentially cause the issue in the forums. This wire right here is coming from the back of the car, the battery. This wire right here is one that I made that goes over to the TGV on this side. And then this wire on the bottom is the one that Rally Spec made and linked it into the TGV on this side. So in the last video, if you guys tuned in, you'll remember me talking about how Rally Spec put in a ground and it fixed the problem for about 10 minutes. So that was really kind of a telltale as well as to how to fix the problem. It wouldn't have fixed it if it wasn't some type of grounding issue. So that's exactly what I did. And didn't really have too high of hopes that that would fix my cam code issue. Went ahead and started it, and it did. So it just goes to show you that things can be tricky, and it doesn't always have to be a code that's gonna direct you in the right place to try to find your issue. I went down a huge hole looking for what was causing the two codes to continue to pop up. Every time I would start it, it would take about 5 minutes, but they would always come back. And so I figured there had to be something wrong with the cam codes. Circuit high, had to be. But it just goes to show you that it doesn't always have to be what you think it is. So it could be absolutely anything, just throwing the ECU off a little bit, and that's exactly what it was. So with that being said, I'm so excited that the car is fixed. Now, I have had the opportunity to drive it around a little bit, and it's just a blast to drive, but we'll talk about that in another video. A little bit of an update as far as the fuel pressure sensor. I talked about that a little more in the last video than I did the actual problem, but yeah, basically our fuel pressure sensor was not reading, and we weren't sure why. And so I talked about at the end of that video that Mike sent me a tune for the left TGV when I meant for it to be on the right TGV, because that's the circuit that it was wired into, and Mike has to pretty much enable the sensor to read on the access port through the ECU. That was not happening, but since then Mike has sent me another tune for the right TGV. So I figured, all right, let's load that in and it'll just read, because that's exactly how it's supposed to work. And loaded it in, and it still doesn't read. So I don't know if there's some type of like extra stuff that he has to do on his end. I'm sure that the wiring is perfect on my end, like I talked about in the last video. So maybe when we go to get the car finally turned up on the dyno, we'll be able to figure that out before, because the fuel pressure sensor is actually not necessary, but definitely helpful when it comes to dynoing the car, because you can actually tell the ECU, well, if the fuel pressure goes down to this, do this with the injectors. So when it comes to tuning the car, you can make fail-safes as to how the fuel pressure sensor is reading the fuel pressure. So that will be very helpful if we can get it to read. And if not, I mean, we'll still be able to turn it up. I don't have any doubts in the fueling system, so I don't really expect the fuel pressure to ever be dropping. So with all that being said, this is where I'm gonna leave you guys for today. I figured that this topic was big enough to where I needed to make an entire video about it because I had a lot of support on the last video. Also, shout out to everybody who tried to help me fix the problem. I'm so glad that we have it fixed. Now we have an opportunity to film even more content for you guys. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. We'll be going over the whole entire battery relocation and the ultimate battery setup for a car like this. So stay tuned and we'll be back for a new video shortly. Peace.